Shalom everyone. Bezat Hashem, we're continuing on in Masechet Sanhedrin today with Hey Amud Bet, and we are going to start at the second line on the page, Yatir Bechorot al Yatir. Our learning today should be as a Refuah Shlema for Yaakov ben Dinah. He should get better and have a total Refuah Shlema speedily in our days. We're going to have two sections in today's learning. The first section we'll deal with will be a continuum from yesterday where we discussed these two stories where Rabbi Chia was seeking authorization for Rabba Bar Chana and for Rav to paskin and judge when they were traveling to Bavel from Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. We'll contrast the stories today and we'll explain why Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi allowed and didn't allow what he did. The second section we'll get to will be really a touching back on a previous topic, the topic of two people judging a case, which we'll see actually will emerge to be a machloket amoraim within a machloket tanaim, Bezat Hashem. So let's get started. The second line of the page of Hey Amud Bet. We had stories yesterday that we left off with, so let's just remember those two stories. We had one story where Rabbi Chia approached Rebbe, again in Eretz Yisrael, and he was seeking authorization for Rabba Bar Chana, who was his nephew, when he was traveling to Bavel, to paskin halacha and to judge cases. And Rebbe gave full authorization. Actually, three things. He said, Yoreh Yadin and Yatir Bechorot, is that he could paskin the halachot associated with Isur V'Heter, prohibitory law. He could also adjudicate monetary cases. And as we said, Yatir Bechorot means he could also look at the firstborn animals to determine if it has a permanent blemish that would now disqualify it from being brought as a korban, and now the Kohen could just eat it by slaughtering it in one of the local butcheries in Bavel. However, when Rabbi Chia approached Rebbe again to get the same authorization for Rav, one of his other nephews, who was traveling to Bavel, although Rebbe did grant him authorization for the first two to adjudicate prohibitory law and monetary law, he did not give him permission to permit the Bechorot, the firstborn animals, by noting its blemishes. So the Gemara wants to know, why is it that he didn't give authorization to Rav for that? So let's see. Yatir Bechorot, we know that Rabbi Chia approached Rebbe and he said, could Rav permit the Bechorot, again these firstborn animals, by recognizing the blemishes on them? And Rebbe said, no, Al Yatir, Rav does not have my authorization for that. Asks the Gemara, my time, what's the reason? We actually left off yesterday saying how brilliant Rav was. So if he was so brilliant, why wouldn't Rebbe grant him that authorization as well, like Rabba Bar Chana received? So the Gemara says, Ilay mishum de lo chakim. If you say it's because he wasn't such a chacham, exactly, the Gemara actually anticipates this. Maybe he'll say it's because he just wasn't wise. He didn't know those halachot. The problem is, or he wasn't intelligent enough to make those determinations. Problem is, we finished off yesterday, we finished off saying yesterday, that Rav was incredibly wise. And actually, we said that's why Rabbi Chia referred to him as the son of my sister, because a sister is a reference to his great wisdom. So that can't be his issue. Maybe you'll say, he was extremely intelligent, but maybe he wasn't proficient in this area. He didn't know necessarily which blemishes qualify as permanent and would now allow the Kohen to eat this animal without bringing it as a korban. Maybe that's why he just wasn't proficient in this area of halacha. But we know that that's not true also, says the Gemara, because V'ha'amar Rav, but Rav himself says, Shmona asar chodashim, gadalti etzel ro'eh behema, leda ezemum kavua ve'ezemum over. It's an amazing thing. Rav says, for 18 months I grew up, or I stayed near shepherd of animals to know what's considered a permanent blemish and what is a passing blemish. Rav went out of his way. He wanted to know the halachot in terms of bechorot, and in order to ascertain that, he did a science project. He went and lived with shepherds of animals so that he could figure out from them and by studying the animals what's considered a permanent blemish and what's considered a passing, a temporary blemish. Rav was incredibly proficient in this area of halacha. So again, back to the question, why wouldn't Rebbe give him authorization to make this determination? It's a fascinating thing also. See, sometimes we think that the Chachamim, they sat in the Beit Midrash and they would never go out and see. Rav wanted to know the halacha. In order to understand the halacha b'chorot, he had to do observation. Observation meant to go live with some farmers. He went to live with the farmers to make this calculation. But the kasha is, bottom line, why wouldn't Rebbe give him smicha in this area of halacha, give him authorization? So the Gemara gives two answers. Ella, rather, says the Gemara, of course, Rav was brilliant. Of course, he had the necessary skill set in terms of the knowledge, the practical knowledge. But really, the reason Rebbe wouldn't give him the authorization for this was lechalek lo kavod l'Rabba bar Chana, in order to distribute honor to Rabba bar Chana. Meaning like this. Rebbe knew when Rav was going to travel to Bavel, everybody would give him great honor, because Rav was far and wide known as such a chacham. Actually, with Shmuel, he was his counterpart, eventually in Bavel, and Rav was brilliant. Everybody knew that nobody was going to denigrate his greatness. But Rabba bar Chana perhaps didn't have the same well-known reputation. So therefore, in order that people would give honor to Rabba bar Chana, he didn't give Rav that same authorization, and he gave it to Rabba bar Chana in order to permit the Bechor, the firstborn. Why? Because people are going to say, look, Rabba bar Chana got authorization that even Rav didn't receive. Of course Rav was deserving of that. Rav was even greater. But he didn't need that in order to be considered significant. But Rabba bar Chana did, so Rebbe didn't give this authorization to Rav, and did give it to Rabba bar Chana, so people would treat him with more dignity. Answer number one. The second answer, the Gemara says actually the reason that Rebbe didn't give Rav this authorization is actually because he was so proficient in this area of halacha. Mishum hagufe de Rav bekia bemume tfei. It's actually specifically because of this that Rav was so proficient in terms of blemishes. The problem is since he was so meticulously careful and so professional in this area of halacha, what may happen then would be v'shari mumi de lo yadi inshi. What could happen is Rav would go to Bavel. There would be a certain blemish that the experts in Bavel wouldn't be sure, is this permanent and they could eat it now, or it's not yet permanent and it's passing. Since Rav was so meticulous, he would paskin with his great knowledge, this is considered a permanent blemish already. You could already slaughter this in Rubashkins and eat it. But Va'amri, the other experts who were there that didn't have Rav's same level of brilliance and expertise, Ki gavna shara Rav. So they'll say, this kind of a scenario Rav permitted, va'atule mishri mum over, and then they'll compare it to a different case without noting the fine distinctions that Rav was able to note, and then other people will begin to permit passing blemishes. That's already considered a permanent blemish, and they'll eat it, which is a problem. So in order that shouldn't become an issue, Rebbe said, I can't give him authorization on this because his level of expertise is such, others will make a mistake if we authorize him to do this in determining a comparison between a Rav's and what they're going to assume. I can't authorize that as well. It's unbelievable. He couldn't give authorization because of how sophisticated Rav's knowledge was in this subject that could cause others potentially to make a mistake. Okay, let's move on. Now in the story, both stories we quoted above, Rabbi Chia asked permission, Yoreh. He asked permission for Rabba bar Chana and for Rav, Yoreh. Yoreh, we said, is prohibitory law. Isur v'heter, right? Prohibitory law. So the Gemara now notes back on that. Yoreh, he said to Rabbi, Rabbi Chia said to Rabbi, could he, which was Rabba bar Chana or Rav, paskin in these scenarios of prohibitory law? And Rabbi said, yes, Yoreh, he could. The Gemara wonders, why was it even necessary to ask permission for this? Where does I understand? If he does have knowledge in the subject of prohibitory law, he's proficient, he's an expert, so you could paskin. I understand in monetary cases, perhaps it's more necessary to get authorization. But in terms of prohibitory law, why is it necessary? The Gemara asks, Igamir, if he had studied and mastered the knowledge of Isur v'heter, of prohibitory law, so Rishuta lamli lamishkal. Why does he have to ask permission in order to adjudicate those cases? It's natural, you understand the halachot, so you could paskin in those areas of halacha. Why was it necessary for Rav and Rabba bar Chana to have permission granted in order to paskin in these areas of halacha? Now Tosafot notes that maybe you'll say, Similar to what we said before, it's just as in regards to monetary law, if they're granted authority, they also have immunity if they paskin wrong. Meaning, in regards to monetary cases, if the judge is granted authority by the Nasi, by the Reish Galuta, like we spoke out, so if he makes a mistake, he doesn't have to pay back the litigants. So maybe you'll say in prohibitory law, it's the same idea, is that if a rabbi paskins that the chicken is not kosher and they throw it away, it turns out that it is kosher, he caused the loss. So if he had authorization, he has immunity, he doesn't have to pay back. But Tosafot says that can't be the reason they needed authorization. Because once they were granted authorization for monetary law, which would make them granted immunity that they wouldn't have to pay back if they made a mistake in regards to dinei mamonot, monetary cases, that would also extend to immunity in prohibitory law. So you wouldn't need permission granted to cover you for immunity purposes, to be exempt from paying if you make a mistake. So back to the question, why do they need to ask permission for authorization to paskin in the case of Isser v'Heter? So the Gemara says this was a takana actually established based on a certain story where we're going to see a student made a mistake, or actually paskin correctly, but he didn't verbalize it clear enough, and then the people that he paskin to subsequently made a mistake. So in order to avoid such issues, we require a student who wants to paskin in prohibitory law to be granted authority by his Rebbe, and his Rebbe will make sure that when this student verbalizes things, they're verbalized clearly. This student doesn't have an issue with communication. What's the story? Mishum ma'aseh shaya, because of a story that happened. Titania, as the Braita explains to us. Pa'am achat, one time. Halach Rebbe l'makom echad. Rebbe went to a certain place. Biranasi. He saw people mixing dough in vessels that were tameh. Now it's important to note, just an idea over here for a second. Really, if there's no Beit HaMikdash, right? So there's no issue with Ta'arot, Kochim. We're not really talking about that issue necessarily. And we're talking about Chulin. We're talking about unconsecrated produce. So Me'ikar Din, really, there's no issue with unconsecrated, unholy produce to become tameh. Unholy food, not a problem. But there were people that were machmir, actually Gemara and Chagiga discusses this at length, that were machmir to eat chulin, even unconsecrated foods, with ta'ara, pure, not tameh, not ritually contaminated. So now, how does food become ritually contaminated? Food becomes ritually contaminated when it comes in contact with a liquid. It's actually an acronym that's known throughout Shas as Yad Shachat Dam. There's 7 liquids that when food comes in contact with those liquids, they're mukhshar lekabel tuma. They become fitting to become contaminated. Now, if they come in contact with something that's tameh, for example, a tameh vessel, a contaminated vessel, they could become tameh. So Rebbe traveled to a certain place that he knew that the people there were machmir, they were careful not to eat foods, even chulin foods, unconsecrated foods, in a status of tum'ah. The problem was, he saw that they were mixing dough, which had been mixed with water, which is one of those liquids that causes it the capacity to now contract tum'ah, in vessels, in kelim that were tmeim, that were tameh. So he couldn't understand why they're doing this if this will in fact contaminate that food, that dough. So Amar Lahem, the Rebbe said to these people there, why are you mixing your dough with tameh vessels? Because now they're going to become contaminated. So Amru Lo, so the people there responded to Rebbe, Talmid Echad Balakan, one of the students came to our place. Ve'horelanu, and he permitted it. He paskind, actually, as we're about to see with their mistake, he paskind that me bitzaim ein machshirim. This is how they interpreted him. That me bitzaim, which means swamp water, not regular water, but me bitzaim. Bitzaim is a swamp, like an agam. Swamp water does not cause foods to become fitting to contract tum'ah. The problem was, he didn't really say that. Now, what was their thought process? They thought maybe real clear water or clean water, those kinds of waters, flowing waters, streams, rivers, etc., those could make a food, if it comes in contact with the food, fitting to now receive tum'ah. But this Talmid told us that if it's from swamp water, stagnant water that's sitting in its place, those types of waters, if they mix with food, it does not cause it to contract tumah. So we have no issue mixing it in tameh vessels, because anyways, the food is not ready to become tameh, it won't become tameh. They thought, therefore, and they're putting in this swamp water, I guess it was clean, but it was sitting water, and therefore they said it's not a problem. But the problem was the student didn't say that. They just misinterpreted. What had the student said? V'hu me beitzim darash lehu. He had said water of eggs, which means if you have eggs and there's a liquid that emerges from those eggs, the liquid that comes from eggs themselves, that is not one of the 7 liquids that causes the food to be able to become tameh if it comes in contact with tumah, and that is the halacha actually. But they didn't understand him. They thought he said mei bitzaim, which means stagnant waters, waters that are sitting in like a swamp. Really, he had said liquid that comes from eggs that comes in contact with food cannot allow it to become tameh from something else. Ve'inu savor mei bitzaim ka'amar. They thought that student had said mei bitzaim. Now, we're going to go on in a minute and show what backed up the reason they made a mistake. But basically, based on that, Rebbe, as we're going to see at the conclusion, is going to say, in order for a student to become able and fitting to paskin areas of Isur v'Heter, his Rebbe needs to write off on him, because his Rebbe needs to confirm this student speaks clearly, can communicate properly, otherwise he could make such errors. Now, what further supported their mistake? V'ta'u nami baha. They also made a mistake in the following Mishnah Mesechet Para. Mishnah Mesechet Para is talking about the para aduma. We know if somebody becomes tamei met, he needs the special para aduma water sprinkled on him. Para aduma is ashes from this red cow, as well as mixed with certain waters. Now the waters that are used to mix with the ashes to sprinkle on tamei met person have to be mayim chayim. They have to be free-flowing waters, spring waters. So the Mishnah in Para aduma tells us Karmion, if you have the waters of Karmion, as we're going to see, is a stagnant body of water. It's a body of water, it's like a swamp. Umei Figa, or the waters that come from this swamp called Figa. Psulin, you're not allowed to use them for Para aduma purposes, Mipnei shehen me bitzaim, because these are stagnant waters. Now that's a Mishnah. So they assumed, based on their false understanding or their mistaken understanding of this student, they said it must be ve'enu savor. They thought midelegabe chatat psili, just as regarding korban chatat, the para aduma, it's considered invalid. It must be these are not deemed water. Achshuri nami lo mechashri. So also in terms of making food fit to contract tumah, it's not considered water, and therefore if it comes in contact with food, you could mix that food in tameh vessels and it won't make the food tameh. Velohi, but says the Gemara, that was a mistake, both from their understanding of that student, as well as their support to their understanding from that Mishnah. Hatam, because regarding para aduma lenyan chatat beinan mayim chayim. Regarding para aduma, the pasuk says it has to be free-flowing water. Those are not free-flowing waters, that's why they're not usable. But over here, regarding making something fitting to become tameh, achshure kodu machshuri. Any types of waters, even if it's stagnant waters, that's still water. That's one of the 7 liquids, and therefore that would cause food to become tameh if it comes in contact. So therefore, Rebbe looked at this situation. He saw a student who said something which they misinterpreted, and Tana, the Braita teaches, Ba'ota sha'a gazru, at that time, after such an incident, the Chachamim made a gzeira, Talmid al yore ela imkein notel reshut merabo, that a student should not paskin the halachot of Isur v'Heter, of prohibitory law, unless he's granted authority from his Rebbe, which Rashi explains is when his Rebbe will give him permission, medak dayek be'shiyeh leshono patuach v'lo yit'ua shomin et varav. He'll be much more careful. Means the Rebbe will make sure that this student knows how to communicate, says things clearly, and then you won't have such issues. Says the Gemara, that's why Rav and Rabbi Bar Chana needed to ask for permission to paskin halachot of Isur v'Heter. Now, a related story the Gemara tells us, Tanchum brei Rabbi Ami ikla lechatar. Tanchum, the son of Rabbi Ami, went to a place called Chatar. Darash lehu. So this Tanchum began to expound the halacha, and he taught the following: Mutar liltot chitin bepesach. It's permitted to soak wheat on Pesach. Now, Pesach, you're not allowed to have chametz. You're not allowed to allow bread or wheat to rise. That's an issue of chametz, of leaven. So, this Tanchum paskind that you're allowed to soak wheat on Pesach if your intent is to crush it immediately after. Because if your intent is to crush that wheat immediately after, it won't allow it to rise, that's not an issue. That's the halachai paskin. Amrulo, the people there in this place turned to Tanchum and they said, Lav Rabbi Mani de Mitzur Ika Acha, isn't there Rabbi Mani, who's your Rebbe from Tzur, who's in this city? Vitanya, and we know that the Braita teaches, Talmid, a student, Al Yoreh Alacha b'makom rabo. Student is not allowed to paskin alacha in the place of his Rebbe. It's disrespectful. Unless he was 3 parsa away from his Rebbe, which corresponds to Machanei Yisrael. Rashi goes through and he explains how the Jewish encampment in the Midbar was 3 parsa, it's a distance. So anyone who had a question would go to Moshe Rabbeinu and inquire. And from this we actually deduce that if there's a situation where a person wants to paskin halacha, a student wants to paskin, and his Rebbe is within 3 parsa, you're not allowed to paskin the halacha within that area. If you're 3 parsa away, you could, but within that area, you're not allowed to. So they said to Tanchum, how could you paskin this halacha if your Rebbe Mani, lives here, and therefore you shouldn't be allowed to paskin? So Rabbi Tanchum said, I didn't realize. I mean, if had I known, I wouldn't have paskin. Because you're right, that is actually the truth. Okay, so we have a similar idea now. This is a separate halacha, but the point is this halacha would imply that not only does a student have to ask permission to paskin isur v'heter, but when it comes to paskining also, you're not allowed to paskin within the parameters of 3 parsa of one's Rebbe. Okay. Now a final story on this note. Rabbi Chia Chazia lahu gaver dehavakai bebeit hakfarot. Rabbi Chia was somewhere and he saw a certain person who he thought was a Kohen, and he was standing in a cemetery. So we know a Kohen is a very high level. He has a special level of Kedusha. He's not allowed to come in contact with the dead. And he saw this fellow, Rabbi Chia saw this fellow, who he thought was a Kohen standing in a cemetery. It's Asur. So Amar Le, Rabbi Chia said to him, Lav ben ish ploni Kohen ata, you're not the son of a Kohen, and if you are, then you should not be allowed to be in a cemetery. Amar Le, this fellow said back to Rabbi Chia, in Avu Adahu Gavra. It's true. The father of that person means my father, Gave Enayim Hava. What happened was, he was a Kohen, but the problem was, he had straying eyes. Natan Enav Begrusha V'chilelo. What happened was, we know that the halacha is, if a Kohen marries one of the women that he's not allowed to, for example, a divorced woman, the issue is, well, it's asur, first of all, but on top of that, the children born of that union have become desecrated. They're chalalim. And based on that, actually, they don't have the same restrictions and kedusha of a kohen. So what happened was, my father married a grusha, a divorced woman. I am a product of that union, I'm a halal, and therefore I'm not prohibited to be in a beit hakfarot. That's the end of the story. Now Rashi wonders exactly what this story is doing here. Meaning, what does this add exactly? So Rashi explains, this adds that even though Rabbi Chia was in the place of his Rebbe, which was Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, he was still allowed to get involved in this scenario where he saw somebody actively doing an isur. Unlike Psak, which was the previous stories, if you're within 3 parsa, you wouldn't be allowed to paskin in the place of your Rebbe. If somebody is actively doing an isur and someone has to step in, that's not a problem. Rabbi Chia was certainly allowed to say, don't be in the Beit HaKfarot if you're a Kohen, because there's an active isur that needs separation. The Le'inyan, Rashi says, Le'inyan afru shemi isura ein kan moreh halacha lefnei rabo. That's not an issue of paskining. Separating a person from isur is not an issue of paskining. That's why we brought this final story. Okay, let's finish up this section with the final point. What we saw earlier was that authority was granted to Rabba, Bar Chana, and to Rav, as in the case of Rav particularly, in a partial sense of authority. Because even though, as we said, Rebbe gave him authority to deal with monetary law and prohibitory law, he didn't give him authority to adjudicate scenarios of the Bechor. Fine. So the Gemara says, Pshita, it's obvious, Lepalga, that regarding partial authorizations, means not full authorization, partially, Haka'amar Demahani. We've said already that that works in the case of Rav, meaning Rebbe granted him partial dominion, partial authority. But the question the Gemara wonders is, Al Tanai Mai. Can a Rebbe or a Nasi or the Reish Galuta in these cases grant authorization on condition? Rashi explains, meaning on a time frame. Can they say, you have authorization to deal with these laws for 1 year? Is that considered legitimate authorization or not? So Tashma, the Gemara says, based on a story, we know the Amar le Rav Yochanan le Rav Shemen. Rav Yochanan said to Rav Shemen, Hare, who was traveling to Bavel from Eretz Yisrael, Hare ata birshutenu, you are under our domain, meaning you have permission to paskin, to adjudicate cases, ad shetavo etzleinu, until you return back to Eretz Yisrael. So we see that there was permission granted for a specific period of time, and therefore we see authorization could be in a particular time frame as well. Okay, moving on now to the second and final section of the day. If we remember, we were discussing previously this idea of adjudicating cases with less than 3 judges. So earlier we brought the Psak of Shmuel. And the Psak of Shmuel was that although it's considered disrespectful or chatzuf, it's insolent for 2 people to adjudicate monetary cases, we're talking about loans specifically. If you remember, this is based on the principle of we don't say Eruv Parshiot. Loans really me'ikar din minat Torah only require 1 judge. It doesn't even have to be professional. It doesn't have to be a smuchin, mumchin. However, the rabbis require 3, but based on that, Shmuel says if 2 people adjudicated this monetary case, it would still be effective, even though it's considered an insolent thing to do. So we're going to get back into that a little bit now. Let's see. Gufa. Amar Shmuel. Shmuel said earlier, Beis, 2 people shedanu, that they adjudicated a monetary case of loans. Dinayim din, so their psak is binding. It is considered effective. Ela shenikra beit din chatzuf, but it's considered an insolent court. Meaning to say is that they've done something wrong, because rabbinically they need to have 3, but since even 1 midoraita would be sufficient, 1 judge, so 2 would also be considered binding. Yativ Rav Nachman v'ka'amar lahashmaita. Now the Gemara continues on with this memra and says Rav Nachman was sitting and he said over this psak of Shmuel. Hey Tevei Rava, the Rav Nachman, so Rava then posed a question from a Mishnah later on Chavtet against Rav Nachman, which is really against Shmuel. Because the Mishnah later says as follows, Afilu shnayim mizakim, when it comes to monetary cases, the Mishnah says, even if 2 people say innocent, or shnayim mechayvin, or 2 people say guilty, which means the 3rd person's opinion is essentially inconsequential because 2 are the majority of 3. But nonetheless, the Mishnah says, the echad omer eni odeh, if the 3rd person says, I don't know, meaning he's abstaining from giving his opinion. He doesn't know. So in such a case, the Mishnah there says, Yosifu hadayanin. You have to add on another judge of the judges so that there's a total of 3. That's the Mishnah later on Chavtet. But it says the Gemara, but if it's true what Shmuel says, that 2 people are sufficient, even though it's wrong, but 2 people can create a monetary conclusion, so lahavu kishnayim shedanu. It should be like 2 people that judge, disregard the 3rd entity, and the halacha should be that's already binding. Why do you have to add on a 3rd person? That shouldn't be necessary. Must be 2 people is not sufficient. Kashan Shmuel. So the Gemara answers, no. Really, according to Shmuel, as we said, 2 people is sufficient, and it's still true. But Shani Atam, it's different in that Mishnah. Initially, when they sat down to adjudicate that monetary case, the intent of the court and the people was to have a court of 3. So in such a scenario, the Gmardin, the Psak, needs to be leveled out by a group of 3. If one of them's abstaining, it's only a group of 2, and that's not going to be sufficient based on the original conclusion that it should be 3. But in this case, meaning where they initially decide we're going to paskin halacha of mamonot, the monetary cases with 2. So there, again, it's the wrong thing. It's considered insolent, disrespectful, but nonetheless, it would be sufficient to have a court of 2 adjudicate that case, and the court case would be sufficient. Now the Gemara says another question Rava posed against Rav Nachman, against Shmuel, because this is a Tosefta. The Tosefta says as follows. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, Hadin bishlosha. When it comes to monetary cases, you need 3 judges. Upshara bishnayim. Now pshara is arbitration or compromise, which means if 2 people come in front of 2 judges, and they say to them, we don't want you to adjudicate our case, rather we want you just to create a compromise between us. This does not have the normal laws of din, and therefore, pshara, arbitration, or compromise, bishnayim, only requires 2 judges. Continues the Braita. Rashim Gamil continues, V'yafeh koach pshara mikoach hadin, the strength of pshara, of compromise, is stronger, is greater than that of judgment. Sheshnayim shedanu, says Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, because if 2 people adjudicate a case of din, ba'alei dinin yecholin lachzor bahen, the litigants in the case can retract and say, we don't accept it anyways. But v'shnayim shasu pshara, if 2 people make a pshara, they make a arbitration, they make a compromise, ein ba'alei dinin yecholin lachzor bahen, assuming that the litigants had accepted the outcome, the litigants are no longer able to retract from the outcome of that compromise. But the kasha you see very clearly is that Rav Shimon Gamliel says 2 people are not sufficient for din. That's only sufficient for compromise. That's not sufficient for court cases. So the Gemara says, l'chara, you see that the Shmuel's psak that said before is that when it comes to din, 2 people, albeit wrong, would be sufficient, is wrong. It's not true. Turning to Vav Mud Aleph, V'chitema, maybe you'll say, it's true. Tosefta quotes Adat Yachid, that's Rav Shimon ben Gamliel. Pligi Rabbanan, Alei Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. Maybe you'll say like this, there is a machloket between the Rabbanan and Rav Shimon ben Gamliel. Rav Shimon ben Gamliel in the Tosefta holds 2 people is not sufficient for monetary judgment. And the Rabbanan argue, and Shmuel follows the Rabbanan who hold it is sufficient, albeit wrong. Maybe that's what you're going to answer. The problem with that is, and we quoted this earlier as well, the Ha'amar Rabbi Yavau said earlier, Shnayim shedanu ledivrei hakol, that when it comes to 2 people who adjudicate a monetary case, ledivrei hakol, according to everyone, regardless of your position about compromise, where there is a machloket later, we'll see if 2 people is sufficient or not, but everyone agrees by a din, by a court case, ein dinei and din. Rabbi Yavau said everyone holds it's not sufficient. So asks the Gemara, it would appear to be, even though there might be a debate by compromise, there's no debate. 2 people is not sufficient for monetary cases. So the Gemara answers, not a question. Rabbi Yavau is an Amora. Shmuel is also an Amora. Amoraim could argue on each other. Gavra karamit, you're bringing a contradiction between 2 men, between 2 Amoraim, meaning to say like this. Rabbi Yavau might have held that there's no debate when it comes to 2 people judging. Everyone agrees that's not sufficient. But Shmuel held that there is a debate when it comes to din. That just as perhaps there's an argument by arbitration, there's also by compromise, there's also an argument by din, by monetary court cases. And therefore Shmuel will hold, the rabbis argue under Shimon ben Gamliel. Shimon ben Gamliel holds it's not sufficient to have 2. Rabbanan hold it is. And Shmuel says, I follow the shita of the Rabbanan. 2 people would be sufficient when it comes to monetary cases. Okay, we're going to stop here at the top of Vav Mud Aleph. We'll pick up tomorrow, continuing to analyze this position of Rabbi Yavau that we just reintroduced with Vav Mud Aleph. Everyone have a wonderful day.